Welcome back to the Lars Larson Show. It's a pleasure to be with you on a Wednesday. Always glad to get your calls. I think we should be just as tough on Republicans as we are on Democrats. Now, I'm a conservative first, a Republican second, because oftentimes the Republican Party not nearly conservative enough for my taste. But are House Republicans breaking their promise to protect American workers? Are they instead selling out to business interests by saying, sure, we'll set up a bunch of visas to bring in foreign workers. They can replace American workers. After all, American workers don't have to have jobs, do they? I'll get into the details of that in just a moment, but first, welcome to the best conversation in talk journalism. It happens right here every weekday at 866-HEY-LARS. That's 866-439-5277. Send your emails to talk@larslarson.com. And let me give you a taste of what's coming up later on this hour. Why won't our Defense Department repair its submarines, but instead is using taxpayer money for service members to get abortions and for drag shows on military bases? Can you believe this? 40% of our submarine fleet is out of commission. It's in the repair yards. We'll talk about some of the details of that, too. Has the rising deficit been caused by the government's tax cuts, or is it primarily a result of simple excessive spending on Capitol Hill? And should we have the opportunity to hear the testimony of Gal Luft? Gal Luft differs on pronunciation. This is the whistleblower who says he has the dirt on the Biden crime family. And what happened almost immediately after he became a whistleblower? Why Joe Biden's Department of Justice decided to bring him up on charges. In other words, it's the kind of behavior you'd expect from the leader of a third world dictatorship, maybe a communist society, where if you choose to stand up against the ruling class, you're going to find yourself accused of a crime. Remember when Lenin's Beria would say, "Show me the man, I'll show you the crime." Why? Because they knew they could bring you up on some kind of charges that might just silence you. And I want you to take just a moment, if you would, to cast a vote in our Twitter poll. You'll find the question every single day from the news of the day. That's what my producers and I do. You'll find it at Lars Larson Show on Twitter and at larslarson.com on our website. Should Donald Trump participate in the Republican primary debates? I would say yes. And I say that even though Donald Trump is my choice to be the Republican nominee next year and to be the president of the United States after the November election next year. That's assuming the Democrats don't get away with cheating as they have before in both 2020 and 2016. But Trump says he is unlikely to take part in the Republican Party primary debates, according to one of his top advisors, Jason Miller, who I happen to know a bit. Miller says it doesn't make sense for Trump to debate with candidates who have low polling numbers. Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, who is one of Trump's top challengers, although saying Trump top challenger when you're running about 20 points behind Trump or 30 points behind Trump, he's not much of a challenger, and he seems to be fading fast in my estimation. He has confirmed that he will attend the debates regardless of Trump's participation. And New Hampshire Governor Chris Sununu, he was mocking Trump for potentially avoiding the debates. And I understand the argument that Trump's making. He's saying, look, I'm already the odds-on favorite to win the Republican nomination, and the contest hasn't even started yet. And despite all the best predictions of the mainstream media, including Fox News, that's gone far out to the left, unfortunately, they all said, oh, DeSantis, he's going to be the guy. Problem is, even with all the bad publicity, Donald Trump is still holding a huge lead over every other candidate who's running for the Republican nomination. And then you got Joe Biden. We'll get into Joe here in just a moment. But you'll find the question this way. Should Donald Trump participate in the Republican primary debates? I'd say yes. If he chooses not to, I understand why. I'm not going to hold it against him, but I think he should take part, although I can see his argument that it only benefits those with really lousy poll numbers and doesn't necessarily augur in Trump's favor. Today's Twitter poll can be found at Lars Larson Show. And it's brought to you by AMAC, the Association of Mature American Citizens. AMAC has the conservative values I believe in. I joined the group years and years ago. You should too. Just go to amac.us or call 888-262-2006. AMAC is better. Better for you and better for America. Before I go to your calls, let me give you just a taste of what's going on here, because Republicans are just as capable of selling us out as the Democrats have been. Republicans have now included a provision in a bill that is supposed to fund the Department of Homeland Security that would expand the number of foreign workers in the United States. Now, Republicans had promised during their campaign before last fall's election to protect American workers. This bill would loosen up the restrictions on what are known as H-2A visas. That allows more industries in agriculture mostly to import foreign workers. It also expands the H-2B visa program that brings in seasonal non-agriculture workers. Think construction and think other trades like that. The critics say the programs displace American workers and suppress wages. I absolutely agree with that. And now we've got the Republicans saying we might just sign off on it. They're simply doing to us what the Democrats do, and that's wrong. We should hold them to their promise. Let's go first to Reese. Hey, Reese, welcome to the Lars Larson Show. What's on your mind? Hey, Reese.
Reese or Randy?
Randy, what's on your mind?
Hey, I heard your comment on the Republicans, how they're turning and doing the same thing that the Democrats have been doing. And, you know, this comment comes really basically just from a tax-paying citizen. I don't want to, originate this from a Republican perspective or a Democrat perspective, but here's my proposal. I'm tired of being lied to. I'm tired of being stolen from. I think it's time that, if we can't do a revolution, and I'm serious about that, if a revolution isn't possible, then we need to do something just as nearly as extreme, and that would be hold politicians to an accountability standard that warrants the penalty, I guess I should say. So if politicians break the law, they hold the responsibility of the body of the people. But if they break the law and I break the law, basically the same law, why should I get 7 years and why should that person get 7 years for that penalty for whatever happened? Just as an example. I don't think
I agree with you, although you've mixed up two things, and just let me ask a clarification. If a politician makes a promise and then doesn't fulfill the promise, that's not a violation of the law. It's not a crime. I don't know that I want it to be a crime, but I do want to hold them accountable by saying if you break significant promises to voters, you should be out at the next election. I agree with that. When it comes to violating the law, if Hunter Biden violates the law, it shouldn't matter that his dear old dad is the big guy and Hunter Biden gets off. He gets to cheat on gun laws. He gets to cheat on tax laws. And because his dad, and only because his daddy, is president of the United States, does he get a free ride? I would agree with you on that altogether. Thanks for the call, Randy. Coming up, is the government spending habit to blame for the rising deficit, or are the 2017 tax cuts to blame like the left would like to claim? We'll talk about that and arm you with some information. Welcome back to the Lars Larson Show. It's a pleasure to be with you on a Wednesday. Always glad to get your calls. I got to tell you something. I get sick and tired of hearing the left saying, well, we just have to raise taxes because, after all, the government is running a deficit right now. And my answer to that is, well, why don't you spend less money and keep your spending within your means? I mean, almost all of us have either personally done this, spent beyond our means for a period of time. There's usually a penalty at the end of that. You got to pay down those bills you ran up. Or you can spend within your means, have a surplus, and decide, well, I'm going to spend the money this way. The U.S. government has, I don't think it's fair to say never, but they have almost always spent outside their means throughout the history of the United States, and that's gone back a long time. Adam Michel joins me now, who's director of the tax policy at the Cato Institute, which is a libertarian think tank. How you doing, Adam?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me on.
So why is this so hard for members of Congress to understand that you can't spend beyond your means and then just say, well, to the American people, you're not giving us enough of your money?
Well, I think it's maybe not hard to understand, but it's easy politically to give people benefits and never ask them to pay the full cost, which is the taxes to fund it. Unfortunately, we're coming up on some deadlines here in the next decade or two where we can no longer continue to spend significantly more than we take in tax revenue. Deficits are projected to rise to 10% of GDP over the next 30 years, and that's certainly unsustainable in the long run. So something is going to have to give. And if you look at projections going out into the future, it's spending that climbs year after year after year, and revenues actually climb as well, just not quite as quickly.
Well, Adam, sketch out for my audience, because I think I do the best job, a non-economist, non-tax expert like you are, to sketch out for them that cutting is a lot harder than you might think, because I've had callers call in and I say, well, what do you want to cut? They said, well, cut the staff. I said, well, you could cut almost the entire staff of the federal government. It wouldn't change that much. It's other spending they do, entitlements being a big part of them. Is it fair to say that because entitlements, promises that we've made to people over the years, I know there are people who dislike calling it entitlements, but I say, well, don't you think you're entitled to Social Security based on, the way the rules were laid out to you? Well, yes, I am. How about Medicare? Well, I'm entitled to that. I said, that's why they call them entitlements. You may not like the term, but those entitlements chew up what, 2/3 of the discretionary spending in the budget?
You're exactly right. The entitlement spending, sort of Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, these things that are on autopilot, that Congress sets a formula and never reassesses, unlike the discretionary spending that you hear about on an annual basis that Congress fights over. That entitlement spending, the mandatory spending, is responsible for almost all of the non-interest spending growth over the next 3 decades as a share of the economy. They're projected to increase 36% over that period of time. And the rest of the budget, whether it be defense or sort of welfare programs, all of that is we certainly spend a lot of money on it, but it's not driving the growth in spending over time. So you can't reasonably balance the budget or even make the budget sustainable over time without bringing those big spending programs into the conversation.
And yet bringing those down, I mean, I guess you have two choices. You could raise taxes to fully fund Social Security, except that doesn't seem mathematically possible. You could also means test it, but then you turn Social Security into a welfare program. You say all those retired people out there who were cautious, paid for a house, put money in their savings account, you don't get anything, or you get a whole lot less. And all the people who spent every single paycheck they had, no matter how big, you get the biggest benefit. That seems morally hazardous, doesn't it?
The reform is certainly politically difficult and a big hurdle that Congress is going to have to deal with. But we also can't say that, we'll just raise taxes to cover the difference. Even if we raise tax revenues permanently to the levels when the U.S. last had a budget surplus in the 2000s, where we were bringing in close to historic levels of revenue, that still wouldn't address the deficit that the Congressional Budget Office projects over the next several decades. At most, it reduces the deficit by 1 percentage point, so from 10% of GDP to 9% of GDP at the end of that window. So the taxes are neither the solution nor the cause of this entitlement spending growth. Instead, we need to address benefit formulas and the way that this money is ultimately pushed out the door.
So, Adam, let me ask you this. When the Democrats make the case, I don't buy it, but they'll say the reason we're short is because of the 2017 tax cuts. And I say, no, it's not tax cuts. It's not, because the tax cuts, correct me if I'm wrong, actually produced greater revenues by cutting taxes. I know that doesn't sound like it makes sense, but it does. When you say, if you go out and make some money, whether you're a big company or an individual, we're going to take less of it, then you go out and you do more of that kind of activity. When the government says we're going to effectively punish you for making money, you say, okay, then I won't make as much money. And that applies to companies and entrepreneurs and everyone else. Am I wrong in saying that the tax cuts in 2017 actually produced more revenue for the federal government rather than less?
Revenues in nominal terms are higher than they were projected beforehand. Some of that is inflation, but some of it is economic growth as well. But even as a share of GDP, if you look back last year in 2022, federal revenues were at a 2-decade high. This year, revenue as a share of the economy is projected to be about a percentage point above the 50-year historical average. So revenue is not the problem. Revenue is projected to be higher than the historical average for the foreseeable future, and is projected to grow over time as well. And so what that tells me is that spending is the problem. Spending is what is projected to grow faster than the economy and significantly faster than revenues.
Well, and at this point, since we've let the problem get to this point, instead of solving it 20 or 30 years ago, how about some radical ideas? I'll throw one at you. There are about 12 government agencies, federal government agencies, I'd love to either cut in half or cut by 90%, or maybe get rid of altogether. I'll start with the Department of Ed. That's going to cost us about $1 trillion over the next 10 years. And most of the spending is not on staff. It's on all these crazy grants they give out. If we got rid of the Department of Ed tomorrow and saved $1 trillion of federal spending, would that make a difference?
It would certainly help, but we can't balance the budget by simply eliminating the Department of Ed or any of the sort of annual appropriations. Eventually, we have to address these entitlements. But yes, we should put all of this other spending on the table as well, because there's nothing to say that 17.5% of GDP is the right amount of revenue to raise. The federal government, I think, could be significantly smaller than that. We could eliminate the Department of Ed. That is something that should be left up to the states. And there's a whole lot more spending we can cut as well. But you still have to address these big mandatory spending programs. There's
okay,
really no way
and
around
let me
it.
ask you this then. I'm talking to Adam Michel from the Cato Institute. He's Director of Tax Policy. What's the best way to address the spending on the entitlements, Medicare and Social Security in particular, because they're the big dogs? So what's the best way of going after it? I mean, from a libertarian point of view, do we say to people, if you've been responsible and put away for yourself, you get punished? And if you've been a spendthrift, like the federal government is, then you get a reward?
So there's certainly no easy answers. One of my colleagues here at Cato, Romina Baccia, has been proposing a BRAC-like fiscal commission like we use to close military bases that are politically sensitive. You put together a panel of experts that figures out the best way to address this impending fiscal problem, bring it to Congress, give them an up or down vote so it doesn't get mired in the political process and people pointing fingers and claiming you're throwing people over a cliff. And that is one way to get around the political problem of reforming these programs. But eventually the programs have to be reformed. They're going to go insolvent in a number of years, and benefits get cut automatically at that point. So the sooner we start making reforms, the less dramatic those reforms and less dramatic those reforms have to be.
Adam, thank you very much. That's Adam Michel from the Cato Institute. Coming up, the Biden crime family whistleblower has now been indicted by the DOJ. We'll talk about that, and I'll get to your calls.
Look, here's what I know about Gal Luck. He was getting paid, like the Bidens, from CEFC. We want to speak with everyone that we can find who was also on the payroll of CEFC, like the Bidens.
That is Congressman James Comer, a Republican from Kentucky. And what's he talking about? He's talking about the fact that the Biden crime family enriched itself with millions of dollars. And I know to a fair certainty that some of those millions ended up in the pocket or the bank account of the big guy, Joe Biden. And here comes a whistleblower, Gal Luft, an informant who said, look, I was involved in this. I was on the payroll too. I'll tell you everything I know. And what happens almost immediately? Joe Biden's Department of Justice moves right against him and says, we're going to charge him with crimes and tie him up in knots. Why? Because of CEFC. We've talked about this company for years. It is a Chinese energy company. We know for a fact already that they gave money to Hunter Biden. It is a suspicion that some of that money went back to Joe Biden. Why was a Chinese energy company giving money to the son of the vice president of the United States? Do I have to draw a map for you on crayon and construction paper to understand why a Chinese energy company would want to do that? And what's the practical effect for you and me? I want to keep reminding you, what's happening is you've got a president who says America will not use its own energy. America will not use its own great nuclear power plant designs. We're building one plant. China is building plants all the time. We're not going to use our own coal. We're not going to use our own natural gas. We're not going to use our own oil. I mean, Joe Biden is demented enough that at his State of the Union address about 6 months ago, he literally got a laugh out of every Republican in the room when he said, we're not even going to need oil in 10 years. Now, does anybody out there with a brain think that's true? And then you get an informant who says, I'll tell you how the Biden crime family was being enriched. And the first thing Joe Biden's DOJ does is say, we're going to charge that guy with crimes and tie him up. Listen to what Comer says about the keys, the left keys.
And anyone who says we shouldn't take Galluff's allegations seriously discounts the fact that the Bidens wanted to share office space with CEFC, even going so far as to saying that Hunter wanted to make an extra set of keys for both Joe Biden, Jill Biden, and the president's brother, Jim Biden.
Yeah, all of that we know for a fact, and Congress knows it as well. And they want to get all the information the FBI claims it has on Gall Luft. Well, Gall Luft is now being accused of acting as an unregistered foreign agent. In other words, the same kind of behavior that Hunter Biden got involved in, acting as an agent of foreign companies like Burisma, like CEFC, except Hunter Biden didn't get charged. Instead, the informant who promises to tell all, he gets charged instead. Listen to what Comer says about this charge that Gall Luft was acting as a foreign agent.
We definitely want to hear more about these allegations, and we want to see the notes from the FBI meeting. They sent 6 FBI agents, according to Gallup, to Brussels to interview him. I mean, obviously, they were concerned about something he had to say. There's some level of credibility there. So there are a lot of questions here, and it's just amazing the Department of Justice moves so quickly against some people. But then, Laura, the ultimate irony is one of the charges they levied against him was not being a registered foreign agent, which is the main thing that we've said the Bidens were all along, unregistered foreign agents.
Unbelievable. That's James Comer, the Republican from Kentucky who heads up the House Oversight Committee. Let me go to your calls now. Let's start with Gary. Hey, Gary, welcome to the Lars Larson Show on this Wednesday. What's on your mind?
Thank you for having me, Lars. I really want to get you to stop whining about Social Security. I've been paying into that thing for 60 years, and it was my understanding that the money was going to go into a lockbox. Instead, the government spent it all. That's still my money. It's not an entitlement.
Well, hold on a second, Gary. The reason they call it an entitlement, like we use any other kind of word to mean a category of things. If I said pickup truck, it means something, so you know what you're talking about. Do you think you're entitled to Social Security?
Yes, I do.
Then why shouldn't we call it an entitlement? That should settle that one right away. I know people say, well, don't call it an entitlement because then it sounds like welfare. Well, it's something you say, I followed the rules, I paid in as required, and I'm entitled to get the payment. What should we call it instead of an entitlement?
Well, I don't think you should be lumping it in with free money, which is...
Well, except for one problem, Gary. Number one, you sound like you know that lockbox nonsense that you just repeated, the stuff that Al Gore promoted for years and was not called a liar, and he was a liar. You know that your money did not go in a lockbox, don't you?
Yeah, and I'm thinking
okay.
about it.
You know that almost as fast as the money came in, it went right back in checks to Grandma and Grandpa decades ago, and you know that the system has now gone upside down. For a while, there was more money pouring in, from people like you and me working paycheck jobs, because I pay Social Security every single paycheck. I pay Social Security. I have for 42 years now. So not quite as long as you, but a long time. I get all that. But when that excess money was coming in, where did you want the government to store it?
I'd like them to get it into an interest-bearing account.
Oh, you did. You wanted the government, the federal government, to drop it into banks and be the biggest banking customer in America?
No, but...
You comfy with that? Because I'll tell you what, Gary, if you were the biggest depositor at the bank you go to, When you walked in the front door, would they give you pretty much anything you want?
I've never had that liberty, so.
I know, but I'm saying imagine if someday you had more money than Jeff Bezos, more money than Elon Musk, more money than Warren Buffett, and you put all of the money that you had in cash money into one bank in your town. Do you think they would do anything for you when you walked in the door?
Well, probably, but
Yeah. Now, do you want the federal government to be that person? What they did was they put it into treasury bonds, which do have an interest rate. They do pay an interest rate. The problem is it's an IOU. In other words, when you walk in and you say, well, where'd my money go? And they said, we loaned it to the government in the form of treasury bills. Well, does it have to be paid back? Yes, it does. Do you know who has to pay back what's owed on treasury bills?
we the people getting screwed.
Well, yeah, right, because we borrowed it from ourselves. And you know who did that? Our elected representatives did that. So to a certain extent, we've created our own problem. And every time somebody brought up an idea on fixing Social Security decades ago, every single person, the vast majority of people said, don't you dare touch it. So when you say I'm whining about it, all I'm saying is, Gary, I'll bet the biggest bill you pay every month is either your mortgage or your rent. Am I right?
That's correct.
Okay, now if you're spending beyond your means, if you came to me and said, Lars, I only make $5,000 a month, but I spend $6,000 a month, and help me solve my problem. If you ask me for help, I'd say, well, what's your biggest bill? And you'd say, well, my mortgage or the rent. I said, find a way to reduce that. You say, no, I want to do all the little stuff around the edges. I want you to tell me to, I don't know, cut my cable package by $20 a month. Would that solve your problem?
I live very frugally.
I'm not talking about you in particular. I'm trying to use this to illustrate if the federal government has a multi-trillion-dollar problem, and it does. Social Security and Medicare are upside down by trillions of dollars, and you want to solve the problem. Do you want to start with the big stuff, or would you rather noodle around the edges?
Well, I'd rather they got rid of the Departments of Labor and Energy and a couple of the others.
I would get rid of the Department of Energy, the Department of Education. I'd get rid of all of those, and all of that is small change compared to the trillions that are owed to people in Social Security and Medicare. And that's the problem. If everybody keeps noodling around the edges, you're never going to actually get to the center of the thing. Gary, thanks for the phone call. Coming up, the Free Enterprise Project has taken legal action against some of capitalism's worst woke offenders. We're going to talk about that coming up next. Welcome back to the Lars Larson Show. It's a pleasure to be with you, and I'll get back to your phone calls and emails shortly. One of the things I don't like is ESG in all its various permutations, where companies and some of the financing companies behind them have said, we want you to not pay attention to making the greatest amount of money for the people who own your company, whether it's stockholders or individual owners of an enterprise. We want you to focus on environment and social governance, ESG. Well, even that term is somewhat dropped to the side. But I'm glad to see an effort by the Free Enterprise Project to take action against both government actors and corporations to try to slow down the spread of all this woke ideology. Scott Shepard joins me now. He's a fellow at the National Center and one of the directors of the Free Enterprise Project. Scott, welcome back to the program.
Thanks so much, Lars. Always great to be with you.
If I've misstated the situation, please feel free to correct me, but what is it that FEP is doing to try to push back against this woke nonsense that seems to be spreading like wildfire, although it's leaving ashes behind at places like Anheuser-Busch and Disney and Target, and I think they richly deserve what's happening to them. But what are you doing to fight back against this?
Yeah, well, I do think that Bob Iger's legacy at Disney is going to be that he will burn the place down to the ground, turned it from a world-bestriding colossus to a small boutique company that sells to the children of upper-middle-class academics. But at all events, so what are we up to? Well, a couple of big things. We've sent a demand letter. We're shareholders, and so we always have to start stuff with demand letters. But we sent a demand letter to Target. Said you gotta fix the way you're treating shareholder assets. I mean, aside from the fact that they celebrated Pride Month by giving over
the
the front of
tuck-away
their stores.
swimsuits and all that stuff.
Well, this lunatic melange of trans extremism, child grooming, and somehow Satanism. They just had, it's 2023, they had to jam that in there. But more worrisome, they've given $50 million of shareholder assets to an organization called GLSEN. And what GLSEN primarily does these days is to convince school teachers not to tell parents when their underage children have gender dysphoria problems, they're confused about what they should be called, they're confused, they're changing their clothes at school, all of this nonsense. So Target thought that it was directly related to their business purpose to give $50 million to that. That's insane. And so we sent a demand letter, and unless they change their ways and stop doing that sort of thing, we're going to be suing them.
You have a shareholder lawsuit.
Be,
just so people understand the relationship, Scott. If I buy, I mean, I don't have any, but if I buy stock, say in a 401k or an IRA, you tend to just put money in an IRA and say, okay, it's going to be invested by some smart people. But if you own stock in a company, the one promise that company has to fulfill under the law is they have to make the maximum amount of return for its shareholders that they can under the law. So they can't go out and break the law, but if they say we can sell more stuff, great, go sell more stuff and make my stock worth more money. That's the promise they make, whether you own one share of Target or 100,000 shares of Target, they've made that promise. When they then say, well, we're going to take some of the money we could have given to our shareholders or put into a bit, more stores and more stuff, and we're going to just give it away to a group. That sounds like a slam dunk case when you walk into court, doesn't it?
Well, I think it should be pretty clear that this violates the fiduciary duties of the directors. What we want to have found is that it not only violates their fiduciary duties, but it violates it in a way that instead of doing the duty to shareholders, they're doing their personal policy preferences, and that's called self-dealing. And so that if that's found, then they have to pay to make up the difference out of their own pockets.
Ouch. So
you've seen that Target's lost 17% of its value, $10 billion, since this all blew up. Now, if the directors and executives of Target were made an example of, and they had to bankrupt themselves, paying the shareholders back for doing politics with the shareholder assets, you can bet we could all see that very quickly. That's the end of ESG. That's the end of this misuse of shareholder assets because, hanging Admiral Byng in the 18th century for the benefit of all the other admirals, all it takes is one blow up like that and the destruction of some bad actors and everybody else learns real quick.
Because
so
everybody else who sits on a board of directors is going to see that story. They're going to pay attention to it, and they're going to say, I don't want to end up like those people. And I'm not going to be covered by errors and omissions, E&O, or whatever they call that, the insurance that people on boards of directors carry. They're not going to be covered because those are conscious decisions they made. Let's give millions of dollars to a political cause instead of investing it by returning it to the stockholders. They're not going to have a defense. And that would start to bring them around, wouldn't it?
That's exactly right. And it's not an error. It's not an omission to confuse Target selling mid-price products to middle-class moms with paying to instruct teachers not to tell those same moms about what's going on with their kids. There's no relationship between those things. That's not an error. That's not an omission. That's left-wingers doing their politics with our shareholder assets. And so if we can get exactly what you said, if we can get that judgment one or two times, then boom, we're going to get companies back to being rational again.
How fast can this happen, Scott? Real quick.
Oh, it's law. It'll take a while.
Come on. You sound like a lawyer.
I think, well, I have that misfortune. Can't you smell the evil over the airwaves? It'll be a couple of months before they fully respond to our demand letter, and then we'll file the complaint, and they'll respond, and they'll seek a motion to dismiss, and it'll drag out for a few years. But we've already got one running against Starbucks for its illegal discrimination policies, and we've got some of those lined up as well, and that's actually in court. So,
Well,
we're racing ourselves to see who we can make the first examples of.
Well, I'm looking forward to it. That's Scott Shepard from the National Center and the Free Enterprise Project. Scott, thanks very much. Hey, if you're a dog parent like me, I got Sir Winston Churchill, my Bernese Mountain Dog, and I remember the first day I saw him almost 3 years ago. I would do anything for my dog, Winston. I'll tell you what, I'll bet you feel the same way about your dog. And you know the key to your dog's healthy life starts with food. And that's why I love Dr. Marty's Pets and Nature's Blend. It's a premium dog food made with simple ingredients like turkey, beef, salmon, and duck. And unlike most kibble, the stuff you buy in the big box store, they bake that stuff with high heat. It destroys the nutrients. Nature's Blend is freeze-dried raw. It's got 0 artificial preservatives, additives, or fillers. And the best part is, it's full of protein, fiber, and omega-3s, doesn't have any junk food, and my dog loves it. The freeze-drying amps up the flavors, creates a delicious texture that even picky dogs love, although Winston's not all that picky. Claim 54% off Dr. Marty's Pets Nature's Blend and get a free pack of premium dog treats. Go to drmartypets.com/pets or text PETS to 511-511. That's PETS to 511-511. Message and data rates may apply, and you're listening to The Lars Larson Show. Welcome back to The Lars Larson Show. It's a Wednesday, and it's my pleasure to bring honestly provocative talk radio to you. And if you want to join the best conversation in talk journalism, it happens right here every day. I want to start with this question. Should a student be published for reading an Abraham Lincoln quote aloud in class? It actually happened. It happened because the student thought, I want to actually bring some good information to class. And he wanted to bring in a book to class for his teacher to review. The story is told at Newsbreak. In the book, there was a quote by Abraham Lincoln that contradicted the lesson that had been offered up by the teacher. The quote involved the one that got him in trouble. Without the military help of the black freedmen, the war against the South could not have been won. And that was President Abraham Lincoln. The student also pointed out that the commonly known story about the Statue of Liberty actually differs from the actual historical account. The book is titled The Secret Origins of Black Americans Utilizing Credible Resources from Government Agencies like the National Archives and the National Park Service. The teacher permitted the student to share the book with the class. Unfortunately, the student faced disciplinary action, this is from Newsbreak, and was suspended the next day. That unfortunate situation is happening in a lot of places. Teachers are concerned that they will be subject to a complaint for simply teaching honestly about U.S. history. That was the comment of Deborah Mencard, who is executive director of Teaching for Change, a nonprofit organization that is trying to make sure that kids get treated fairly. Now, what do you think? A kid comes to class, he says, this is a legitimate quote from one of the best presidents in American history. I actually put Washington a little bit higher on my list because he was the founder of our country and he set us on the right course and he won the revolution. And it was tough, but he won. But Lincoln kept the Union together. And he did so at great cost to himself, ultimately at the cost of his life. And he was assassinated by people who didn't like the idea that Abraham Lincoln thought that someday black Americans would be allowed to vote and hold office. He said so out loud. And at that point, John Wilkes Booth standing in the audience, and there's a photo of that event, an early photo from that time. Wilkes apparently turned to a companion and said he must be run through. And that's why it happened. So, do you want to hear the real history? Or do you want to hear the woke version of history that's offered up by unionized classroom teachers in government-run schools? Well, a lot of Americans are answering that one by saying, I'm getting my kids out of the public schools. They're being damaged there. They're not being served there. Our tax money is being wasted there. And we want the ability to have school choice. This is just another piece of information in support of that. Glad to be with you and glad always to take your calls. Let me go first to Doug in Kansas. Hey, Doug, it's a Wednesday. It's the Lars Larson Show, and I'd like to know what's on your mind.
Well, I don't like the way they're handling the entitlements because they're not really hitting the nail on the head.
You're talking about Social Security and Medicare? Just so everybody else is with us on the conversation, you're talking about government programs known as entitlements, Social Security and Medicare, right?
Right. Well, as far as the medical part of it, they're not laying the law down with these doctors, hospitals, nursing homes, and clinics We need to go back to the old-fashioned way of healing the poverty-stricken and getting them out of the office. Instead, which I know for a fact they're doing this, they play with you and they keep bringing you back to the doctor's office, and they're just milking it because of the numbers. And we need to heal these people and get them out of the doctor's office.
How would you say, Douglas, what would you suggest they do to heal them? I'm not saying it's a bad idea, but how do you go about doing that?
Well, they know what to do, but here's the other problem you get into. We got to fix our food supply and the raising of our cattle and everything that's going wrong there, the bad herbicides, pesticides, growth hormones, steroids, and bad fertilizers that make up for most of the diseases that we have in this country.
Can you tell me what a bad fertilizer is, just since you mention it? Because fertilizer was a giant innovation in American farming when farmers, and it depends on what fertilizer you're using, but there were farmers who said, I'm never going to use fertilizer. I'll just grow what grows on my land. And when their competition across the road would put fertilizer down and their wheat field looked like $1 million, that's how they were persuaded to use it. What is a bad fertilizer?
Well, the ones with all the chemicals and the stuff that's hurting the human body and causing cancer and all that stuff. The organic stuff isn't hurting everybody.
Well, you're talking about using manure as fertilizer, because if we go back to that, you stop using the modern fertilizers we use now, you're going to cut food production in this country dramatically. I've seen some of the numbers.
Well, I'm not talking about doing that. We do have good fertilizers that we're doing good with. We just need to outlaw all the bad stuff.
Well, who decides which one's the good one and which one's the bad one? Because, Douglas, do you want the U.S. Congress to be running farming operations in this country saying we're going to ban this fertilizer or that fertilizer?
We've got people that know.
Yeah, the problem, Douglas, can I point out to you? Do you know the phrase "follow the science"?
Yeah.
How'd that work out over the last 2 or 3 years?
That's the trouble.
Well, and I'm just saying, when you say we got people who know what's the good fertilizer and what's the bad fertilizer, you got to trust that they ain't going to put their own personal agenda in on that, as they did during the so-called pandemic.
Well, listen to this. We think it's more important to take down statues and rebel flags instead of fixing our food supply and the water.
And that's a very good point. Douglas, thank you very much. I appreciate the call. By the way, Vice President Kamala Harris now going viral for her description of artificial intelligence. You heard it in the open to the show just now. During a White House meeting, she said, and I kid you not, this woman sounds like she's as dumb as a bag of hammers. AI is kind of a fancy thing. First of all, it's 2 letters. It means artificial intelligence. It's as though she's not vice president, she's Captain Obvious. Harris was roasted online for the comment, along with a lot of the other things she says. Are the Biden people forcing her to come off as dumber than she actually is, said my friend Derek Hunter. He put that out in a tweet. Derek writes at Town Hall. But the fact is, Kamala Harris has to be acting dumb. I mean, nobody could be just naturally that dumb. AI is 2 letters. It stands for artificial intelligence. Can you believe this woman is vice president of the United States? It seems unbelievable to me. Now, our Twitter poll today. Should Donald Trump take part in the Republican primary debates? I would say generally yes. Donald Trump is saying no. And Trump is my guy. I'm going to support Trump to the nomination. I'm going to support him till he wins the presidency in November of next year. But he does make a decent argument. Trump is saying he's at the top of the polls right now. He's leading all of the other Republican candidates by gigantic margins. I mean, Mike Pence is way in the dust on that contest, and Ron DeSantis is not even close. So Trump's argument is, why should I take part in the debates if all they're going to do is potentially bring my competition up and bring me down? And that's not a bad argument at all. You can find the Twitter poll at Lars Larson Show, and it's brought to you by AMAC, the Association of Mature American Citizens. AMAC has the conservative values I believe in. I join, you should too. Just go to amac.us or call 888-262-2006. AMAC's better for you and better for America. Coming up in just a moment, we'll talk about Lena Khan on the FTC. Welcome back to the Lars Larson Show. It's a Wednesday. Your calls are welcome to it. 866-HEY-LARS. That's 866-439-5277. Send your emails to talk@larslarson.com. Well, the YMCA, which was once known as the Young Men's Christian Association, seems to be behaving in anything like a Christian manner. An example from Springfield, Illinois, where they have apparently kicked a young girl, 16 years old, off her swim team because she objected to being exposed to naked men in the women's locker room. They kicked the 16-year-old girl off the swim team. I was once on a YMCA swim team in Tillamook, Oregon. The girl raised her concerns with the head swim coach and the YMCA CEO, but they claimed nothing could be done due to discrimination laws. When the girl and her teammate hung signs in support of their position, they were called hate speech, and the girl was asked to leave the team. The incident has sparked controversy, and a press conference is scheduled. Let me ask you this. If your 16-year-old daughter decides that she wants to be on a swim team, and then she comes home one day and tells mom and dad, by the way, we were in the locker room and there was a naked man in there and we complained about it, and they said we're not allowed to complain about a naked man in the girls' locker room because he has a right to be there under discrimination laws. What would you do as mom or dad if you got that report from your daughter? Second thing, well, let me grab a call first. 866-HEY-LARS. That's 866-439-5277. What's that? Oh, that's right. I want to tell you about Los Angeles. Los Angeles apparently has no problem with homeless drug users, drug addicts, and drug dealers on the sidewalks, but an American flag, that's just too much. There's a guy who owns a business. His name is Eric Ayer, and he says that city enforcement officials keep targeting him. And why? He has what's called a sidewalk sign. In some towns, they're called A boards. So it's just a couple little pieces of lumber, maybe a foot and a half wide, a couple of feet high, and it forms an A on the sidewalk, and you put your store's sign on there so that people walking by will notice that they're walking by your store. Many cities will charge businesses tens or even hundreds of dollars to be able to place a sign out there. Well, this guy, Eric Ayer, he owns Moto Styles, which is a motorcycle accessory and remote control hobby store. He says code enforcement has been to his business a number of times, and he keeps getting tickets because he's flying an American flag. And despite all of his complaints to city officials, he got no response at all. He says officials are focusing on minor infractions like the sign while overlooking the issue of homelessness in the city. He's considering packing up his business and leaving California altogether. And the city of Los Angeles, when reporters call, they're not terribly responsive at all. They apparently don't care that they might be losing an actual working business owner instead of losing some of the homeless addicts who are living on their streets. Now, I told you about today's Twitter poll. Did Donald Trump, or should he, participate in the Republican primary debates? I would say yes, but Trump has decided it's really not worth his time. It only benefits his competition. Yesterday's poll, boy, did I get some interesting email on that. I pointed out that the FAA has now approved the first electric vehicle for test flights, not an airplane, but a flying car. The car will do about 200 miles on the road. It'll do about 110 miles in the air. And I'll tell you what, I've been stuck in traffic enough times to I sure wish I could just take off and fly over all this stuff. Now, if everybody did that, and I don't have the money to buy one of these things, they're $300,000 a copy, but the FAA has given an airworthiness certificate for the first electric vehicle that is both a car and a flying vehicle. Is the world ready for flying cars? I said yes. I was in the minority this time, 27%. 73% of you said no, we are not ready, not yet for the Jetsons. We're not ready for flying cars. By the way, I want to point out that there's a story that's now getting a lot of national attention. We actually brought it to you about 2 weeks ago. I was tipped off by my friend Ari Hoffman. Ari is both a writer for the Post Millennial. He's also a talk show host in Seattle on our affiliate station, KVI. He pointed out to me that a longtime Jewish summer camp in Washington State, it's Camp Solomon Schechter, is now bragging on its website that it will hide queer or gender transitions of its campers from their parents. Now, this is something that's been going on in the public schools for a time, and now apparently they've decided to let it expand to other places, even private organizations like Camp Solomon Schechter. They're going to allow biological boys to room in the cabins at summer camp with biological girls, as long as the biological boys say they identify as girls. Yeah, what could possibly go wrong with that? And now they say that if one of those students who's going to the Jewish summer camp transitions, gender transitions from male to female or female to male, that they'll actually hide that information from their parents. I can only hope that parents will say, whether my kid is transitioning or not, I'm not sending my kid to your crazy summer camp. Keeping secrets from parents should be an automatic no-brainer and a deal killer every day of the week. The Daily Caller has an exclusive report that the chair of the House Homeland Security Committee, that's Mark Green, is about to drop a 100-page report detailing his committee's findings on the Department of Homeland Security and the failures of Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas at the U.S. border. As you know, about 9 million illegal aliens have crossed into the United States. In fact, it's become so routine under Joe Biden that it's almost as though the story has largely disappeared from the news, even though we know that people are still crossing into the country illegally. Oh, and then you've got this. U.S. annual inflation. I know it's getting a lot of positive hits, but let me give you a different perspective. Inflation slowed to 3% in June. That still means that prices are going up, but they're going up at 3% a year. They were going up as fast as 9% a year because of some of the colossal mistakes made by Joe Biden. Well, now Joe Biden gets to brag and say, why, this is the lowest level of inflation in more than 2 years. Let me remind you that 2 years ago, in the summer of 2021, 2 years ago, Joe Biden was asked about the inflation that was just getting going at that point. And reporters would ask him about this. What about the inflation? He was at that point about 6 months into his presidency. He said it's temporary. It'll go away. It's transitory. It'll go away very quickly. Well, it hasn't. It hasn't. It's dropped down to 3%. But 3%, let me point out, the day that Joe Biden took office as president of the United States, inflation was running at 2%. So in other words, right now, with inflation at its lowest level in 2 years, it is still 50% higher than it was when Joe Biden took the oath of office. And then I have to tell you about this. This really got under my skin. I've never been able to sit on a jury in a court trial. I would love to sit on a jury in a court trial. I'm reasonably sure that most defense attorneys would never let somebody like me on a jury. And the one time I got asked, I was already assigned, because of my work, I was already assigned on a trip to go to Israel. And so I went on that trip instead. And that was a reasonable excuse because I couldn't move the trip. Why did Governor Gavin Newsom agree to let Manson family member Leslie Van Houten be released from prison? Now, you may or may not recognize that name. If you're as old as me, you would. She was a follower of Charles Manson, who was convicted in 2 killings, the Sharon Tate killings. She is 73 years old. She's been in prison for 5 decades, but that's not the important part. The important part is she was sentenced to life without the possibility of parole, and now she's going to get it. Hey, if you're a dog parent like me, you got a great dog in your house, or 2 or 3, I'll tell you what, Sir Winston Churchill stays with me in the studio most days of the week. It's safe to say I'd do anything for Winston. He's just a great dog. And I know you probably feel the same way about your dog or dogs. The key to your dog's healthy lifespan, it starts with food. And that's why I love Dr. Marty's Pets. Nature's Blend is their premium dog food, made with simple ingredients like turkey, beef, salmon, and duck. And unlike most kibble, you know, the kind of stuff that's baked at high heat that destroys the nutrients, Nature's Blend is freeze-dried raw. It has 0 artificial preservatives, additives, or fillers. And the best part is it's full of protein and fiber and omega-3s. Doesn't have any junk food in it. You should check it out. Claim 54% off Dr. Marty's Pets Nature's Blend and get a free pack of premium dog treats. Go to drmartypets.com/pets or text PETS to 511-511. That's PETS to 511-511. Data rates may apply. Welcome back to the Lars Larson Show. So is anybody going to suggest that Associate Justice to the U.S. Supreme Court Sonia Sotomayor ought to be impeached because I know there's been criticism of Clarence Thomas. I know there's been criticism of Justice Alito. But I want you to hear what Sonia Sotomayor has been doing for about the last 15 years. She's made literally millions of dollars in that time. And you might think that Supreme Court justices are extraordinarily well paid. They're not. And I'm not using that as a justification for the kind of financial antics that we hear about. Supreme Court justices make a couple of $100,000 a year, which is a lot of money for the average person. But they're in an environment where if you're a top flight lawyer, let's say at a big law firm somewhere in Washington, D.C. or New York, $200,000 a year is what they pay starting associates straight out of law school. So we're paying the justices a relatively small amount of money. On the other hand, the justice gets the job for life, and they can quit or not quit anytime they want. They can work all the way to their dying day, and they get a pension that effectively pays them the same amount of money till their dying day. Now, that's a pretty sweet deal, even if the amount of money you're getting at any given moment, $200,000 a year, pales by comparison to other kind of law jobs. But here's what Sonia Sotomayor has been doing. It turns out the Associated Press, believe it or not, and then I'll get to calls, the Associated Press, which is ordinarily kind of a left-wing news organization, they have some good reporters. And they went and dug out information on Sonia Sotomayor. Turns out she has written 6 books. You say, okay, that's not a big deal. 2 of them are about subject matter. She could have written about freedom or the Constitution. She wrote 2 books about herself. Okay, a little narcissistic, but okay. She also wrote 4 other books, though. And what are those 4 other books? They're the kind of kids' books that you could probably write, if you're a good writer, probably knock one out in a week or 2. So she wrote 4 kids' books and 2 books about herself. Now, you can imagine that those books are not huge sellers. In fact, I think one of them is ranked at over 9. They have a list of books on Amazon and how well they sell. It's about 900,000th on the list in terms of popularity. But she has a way to make people buy her books. And she's using her own taxpayer-funded staff to make it happen. She will be, someone will inquire about having Justice Sonia Sotomayor come and speak to their group. And the group will be told, and apparently the emails that the AP unearthed were pretty explicit. They said, she'll come and talk to your group, but you have to buy a whole bunch of her books. In fact, in one case, she was scheduled to speak at a public library. And they told the library, her staff member, whose name is An Lee. An Lee, who is a taxpayer-funded staff member of Sonia Sotomayor, informed the library that if people had to have one of the books, buy one of the books to be able to get into the event. So the way I look at it, you may look at it differently, but the way I look at it, you've got a public employee in Sonia Sotomayor who's going to go speak at a public library owned by the citizens and funded by the taxpayers. And in order to get in to hear this public employee, a Supreme Court justice, speak, you have to buy a copy of her book. And her staff told the library 250 books is not going to be enough. You need about 1,000 books because everybody who comes in needs to buy a book. And so by doing it this way, in the last 15 years or so, Sonia Sotomayor has cleaned up. She's made about $3.7 million on book sales. And of course, if she's publishing the books herself, or if she has a good deal with the publisher, then she gets a chance to put all that money in her pocket. Now, do you hear anybody on the left who's saying we ought to impeach Sonia Sotomayor for that kind of self-dealing, where she says, you want to hear me speak? I'm a Supreme Court justice. Buy my book. You don't buy my book, you don't get a seat at the table. To calls down. If you want to join the best conversation in talk journalism, it's 866-HEY-LARS. And if you're a naysayer, I'll put you first in line at 866-439-5277. You can send emails to talk@larslarson.com. Let's go to Chris in Nevada. Chris, thanks for listening on KKFT. What's on your mind?
How you doing, Lars? I was kind of upset about the YMCA girl that got that got kicked off the team for not wanting to be in the same bathroom with the tranny or whatever. And
Yep.
I don't understand why the schools don't give them their own separate space to let them have their own locker room where they won't be around girls or boys. They'll just be around people that think like them.
I can tell you why. I think I can tell you to a fair certainty why. Because when Obama was president, he insisted that trans had to have equal treatment. And what they meant by that, and he made it clear, they call it guidance. When a president or the Department of Education sends out a message saying, we want you to do it this way, they put a warm, fuzzy name on it. It would be like if you went to work one day and the boss came down and said, Chris, here's some guidance. Now, you're reading this statement from your boss. Would you take that as just a warm suggestion, or would you take that as this is the way the boss wants it done?
Since he's paying me, it's the way he wants it done.
Exactly. And public schools get some money, not a lot, but they get many of them get about 10% of their budgets from the federal government. I don't think they should get a dime from the federal government. I think the best decisions about schools are made locally. This, however, but to back to why they did it this way. The Obama administration at the time, and I remember because we debated this, we had people make the same suggestion you did. It's a very sensible one. You want to be trans, which means you're not a girl and you're not a boy because maybe you're a biological boy, but you see yourself as a girl. Fine, we'll give you a separate locker room just for you. That's your idea, right?
Yes, sir.
And what the Obama administration told the schools, which are government institutions, was they said, it's not good enough to give them a separate dressing facility because that's treating them differently. It would be, and I'll make this, I don't agree with this, Chris, but sometimes to be able to make the best argument against something, you have to understand what their argument is. Their argument is that there was a time, for example, in America where there was a drinking fountain in the park, and it said blacks only. And there was another drinking fountain that said whites only. You say, well, you got a drinking fountain. That's the drinking fountain for black people. This is the drinking fountain for white people. And they said it's separate, but it's equal. And they tried to do that with schools as well. I don't think it was very smart. But in this case, the people who are pushing the LGBTQ plus and all the rest of that stuff agenda, they see themselves and they make frequent comparisons to the black civil rights movement in the 1960s. And they say you can't treat us separate but equal, because that's not equal. You have to let us, if a young biological boy who says, I am actually a girl because in my head I'm a girl, then you have to let him go into the girls' locker room with the other actual girls and undress and shower and change into their swimsuit or their workout clothes or whatever. And if you make them go into a separate facility, then they see that as separate but equal, and they're not going to accept it. And that's already now with the YMCA is a private organization. They could do what they want, but they've chosen to go this route.
You answered it. I appreciate it, Lars. But if I was her father, I'd be very upset. I wouldn't even know how to handle something like that.
Well, I'll tell you what I would do, Chris, because people always say, well, what do you do about this? And I say, okay, I'll try and give you some practical advice. I think that members of the YMCA, remember what that stands for, Young Men's Christian Association, they should get together and sign a petition and say, if you don't change this policy and protect our girls from being exposed to a biological man in the locker room, then we're withdrawing from the YMCA. We won't give you another single dime. YMCA might actually pay attention to that. You're listening to The Lars Larson Show. Welcome back to The Lars Larson Show. It's a pleasure to be with you, and I'm always glad to get to your phone calls and emails. If I had to make a guess, I would guess that for about the next decade, we're going to hear the excuse that almost everything in the world that goes wrong is going to be the cause or caused by the pandemic. I know we're going to hear that excuse. I don't think it's a legitimate excuse, because this country was ready to take off and get back to work very, very quickly. But the folks in teaching, represented by unions, most of the schools in America, K through 12, are public schools, meaning government-run schools. And the reading and math scores among students in those schools have now dropped to the lowest level in decades, in some cases lower than they were before the pandemic. And now that we're out of the pandemic, they can't keep using that excuse, except I'm reasonably sure they will. Terry Schilling knows that. He's president of the American Principals Project. And I thought we'd talk about what's going on, how do we fix it, and is it just time to abandon the government-run public schools and tell parents, here's a voucher, go find the education for your kid that actually does right by your kid. Terry, welcome back.
Thanks so much for having me, Lars. Love coming on.
If I've got any of that wrong, let me know. But this is a problem where you have a massive amount of both federal and local money that is spent on public education, lousy results, and results that are now below the level they were before the pandemic. Is there any chance that we can actually get the government schools to perform for kids again?
Well, look, Lars, I don't think we have any other option besides to fix the public schools. They're too important, and there's too much money that goes through them, right? What's frustrating for me is, as a parent, they have been the teachers union and all of these government officials have been doing everything to weaponize the system against getting us involved, against having us help. This is a 5-alarm fire right now. Our kids can't read. A minority of them, and I'm talking 32%, can read at grade level. Right, that's 5-alarm fire situation, and they should be asking for all the help and all the help, input that they can get from parents. I think really the problem is, Lars, is that we have already abandoned the public school system, and this is where it turns into. It turns into where your kids can't do basic math, they can't read basic things, but they're going to know and they'll be really fluent in the 97 million different gender varieties there are. This is a nightmare, and we need to reclaim the system.
Well, I guess my approach, and by the way, for anybody listening, and if you're wondering, I went to public schools the entire time I was in K through 12 schools. My wife went to public schools. My adult kids, my stepkids, went to public schools. So it's not as though I'm approaching this like an awful lot of the elites do, where Barack Obama or Hillary Clinton and the rest, their kids all went to private schools, and they may have a different view of it. But as far as I'm concerned, the fastest way to reform this would literally be to put a financial gun to the head of the government-run so-called public schools and say, parents are going to be given the option to take their kids somewhere else. So you start fixing things or you're going to lose your lunch. And in the meantime, we're going to give parents a choice. If we do that, it doesn't mean the government-run schools go away, but it does mean they've actually got some competition. And they're told, get things straightened out or you're going to go out of business. And that's what everybody in every other walk of life in America has to face up again. Doesn't matter what business you're in. If you're not performing, you go out of business. And until the public schools face that kind of consequence, I think they're just going to keep saying, we're failing your kids, now give us more money. Am I wrong?
No, I don't think you're wrong. And I will agree with you on all of that. But I think the real problem is that there's too much money in the system that's rigged against our kids and the parents, right? And what I mean by that is you have hundreds of billions of dollars that go into our public education system in this country, and then the teachers unions take money forcibly out of a lot of these teachers' hands. The NEA, right, the National Education Association, they spend over $100 million a year. Right, the American Federation of Teachers, they spend close to $200 million a year. Where is the lobby for parents? Where we don't have anything that can compete with that because they're using the billions and billions of dollars of taxpayer funds to punish the politicians that go in and reform the system. And so you really just need kind of like a maniac or like a madman who doesn't care about the ads the teachers unions are going to run against them to go in, reform the system, and break it because it's already broken, but we need to break the power structure and the money structure.
Okay, and I'd love to do that. And I guess what I'd suggest is the unions collect this massive amount of money. I mean, pick any state. I'm standing in a state where I think there are about 50,000 classroom teachers, and they pay about $1,000 a year, which means the union takes in $50 million. Now, Terry, how much of that do you think actually gets spent on representation, lawyers, accountants, and people who negotiate contracts? 5 million of it, maybe, and the rest of it goes to politics. So what they've been allowed to do is run a political organization that also does unionizing on the side, rather than a union that does a little bit of representation of its members at the Congress and at the state legislature.
That's exactly right, Lars. And that is why you have seen test scores continue to plummet. Meanwhile, the amount of money that we pay in public education has skyrocketed. And here's the most alarming thing. The NEA and the AFT, guess what 50% of their membership is? It's not teachers, it is the administrators, the bureaucrats that have been put into these public schools to abide by all the federal and state regulations that they have, and to do the DEI program, the diversity, inclusion, and equity program. All of that stuff, it's all getting drained, and it's because these teachers unions get to spend taxpayer money. They don't have to go out and earn that. They don't have to go out and work for it. They just have to put pressure and increase their annual budget every single year. There's no consequences to having illiterate students when you're in the biggest and largest special interest group in the country, which is one of them is the teachers union.
See, there ought to be a way to legally go after them. I mean, Terry, if I went to my boss and say, hey, boss, go to the board of directors, get me a raise. And when you do, I'll give you 10% of it or 20% of it back as a kickback. That would be thoroughly illegal. And yet when a union is allowed to say, I'll tell you what, we're going to go to the state legislature or the Congress, but mostly state legislatures, schools are funded locally, and we're going to say to them, you give our members a raise. And if you don't, if you do, we'll give you a lot of campaign money. If you don't, we'll give all the campaign money to your opponent. Now, that kind of extortionist behavior, I think, is that's the usual course of business for unions. But does that sound legitimate? To be able to bribe the people on the board of directors, the legislature in that case, to get the money you want and reward them? Because that sounds illegal to me.
No, it definitely is. And if it isn't, it should be. This is the other thing is that, when we've had all these problems with schooling, there's been a lot of discussion nationally and locally about retaking the school boards. Well, guess what? The teachers unions have co-opted all of those elections, and they're the ones that are flush with. They can put in $150,000, and they do that here in Northern Virginia where I live.
I don't doubt it. Welcome back to the Lars Larson Show. It's a pleasure to be with you, and I want to get your phone calls and emails. We'll get to those in just a moment at 866-HEY-LARS. That's 866-439-5277. Send your emails to talk@LarsLarson.com. Vote in our Twitter poll. You'll find that at Lars Larson Show and at LarsLarson.com. And I'll tell you what, if you're a naysayer, we will put you right to the head of the line. And I might get some naysayers on this. First, I'll disclose my dog in the fight. Is college a good deal for Americans? And I would argue it's not. In general, it's not. Now, am I arguing that we ought to have doctors or lawyers or engineers or accountants who don't have the appropriate educational credentials? No, of course not. There are jobs that you need that level of training for. But what you routinely hear from politicians is, we want all of our kids to go to college. Well, that's not only foolish and wasteful, it's just stupid. And I'll tell you why. Because I've talked to so many economists, and one of the questions I love to ask economists is, in a technological society like America, what percentage of all the jobs in the country would benefit from somebody who has a 2-year degree or a 4-year degree? And routinely they'll tell me 28 to maybe 30%. Do the math. That means 70% or so of all the people who graduate from high school should not go to college. They may need some training to do the job that they're going to do. It may be in the trades. It may be in a number of places where some training would be good. But a college degree doesn't make any sense. And guess what's happened recently? There's a brand new poll, and I want to tell you the results of the poll. But in general, Americans' confidence in higher education is down sharply. And I don't just think that that's because of all the money that is owed by all the Americans for college loans, where people have gone out and borrowed gigantic sums of money, tens or even hundreds of thousands of dollars, to get an educational credential that does not lead to a job that makes that educational credential worthwhile. And I know I've heard from people who say, well, Lars, education in and of itself has a value. That's a philosophy that I completely agree with. I've read books about subjects that I never expect to be relevant to my life, and I think I'm better off. I've read books about World War II Well, World War II is a long time ago. I've read books about Vietnam. That's a long, long time ago. Does any of that necessarily have relevance half a century or three-quarters of a century later? Probably not. But is it worth knowing those things? Absolutely. But that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about whether or not we now have about 45 million Americans who've borrowed about, the total number is about $1.7 trillion to go to college. And many of them don't want to pay the money back. I would suspect, and I've told you this before, that if you go out and spend 50 grand to become a nurse, and they routinely hire nurses now straight out of school for about $60,000 a year, borrowing 50 grand to get the training necessary to be a nurse at a starting wage of $60,000 a year, and the top end wage for nurses can be well above $100,000. That one's an easy, easy calculation. Of course, it's worthwhile. On the other hand, if you get all of the other degrees, a lot of the other degrees, especially the ones that end in the word studies, it's not worth so much. And so Americans are seeing this. Americans' confidence in higher education, according to this new poll, has fallen to 36%. And that's dramatically below what it was just about 8 years ago. In 2015, 57%, a solid majority of Americans had confidence in higher education. It has gone from 2015 at 57% to 36%, down 20% in just 8 years. In fact, it fell as well. In 2018, it was at 48%. So just 5 years ago, almost half of Americans had faith in college education. The number is now just barely above 1/3. Now, that decline is being tracked by Gallup. It was a Gallup poll that produced those results. And they say that confidence in 16 other institutions has been waning in recent years, probably a lot of government institutions where you say, do you trust the military or the Pentagon or the police or the courts or the cops or the prosecutors? An awful lot of those institutions of our country, not just our government, but our country, have dropped dramatically. It's just absolutely amazing how much faith has been lost. Now, I want to ask you about this. Do you trust the FBI anymore? I don't. I really don't. I don't trust the FBI. There are too many ways that the FBI has simply decided to become a political organization. And they've been doing it not just for a little while. They've been doing it for the better part of the last decade, if not longer. And I'll give you a list that I saw at Gateway Pundit that I thought was a great list of many of the things that the FBI has done. But consider, what was supposed to be the premier investigative agency in federal law enforcement. So the FBI works for the Department of Justice. It investigates crimes, allegedly. It even has a role in national security and investigating foreign intelligence gathering on American soil because the CIA is not allowed to operate on American soil. And again, that's only in theory too, because I have a feeling the CIA violates that rule as well. But they literally put out a tweet from the FBI this week, and it says, justice is better than revenge. You may not be Superman, but you can help the FBI protect the country. If you have information about a federal crime, speak now. And they give a number, 800-225-5324. And I'll repeat that number if you want. You know what I wish would happen? I wish a whole bunch of Americans would start calling that number and say, I know of a tax cheat. His name is Hunter Biden. His dad works at the White House. Or I know of a criminal. He operates a criminal organization called the Biden crime family. His name is Joe, although he goes by the moniker The Big Guy, and he works at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. Would you please investigate him? Consider what the FBI has done, and then you tell me if there's any way, in any way, shape, or form, can you trust the FBI? They spied on President Trump based on phony information. That is provably true. There were reporters who laughed at Trump when he said they were spying on me and wiretapping me at Trump Tower. Turned out it was absolutely true. Who was behind it? The FBI. They lied to the American people about spying on Trump. They flatly denied it, and then they got caught. They had Hunter Biden's laptop in hand for a long period of time before the New York Post ever published the story about what became known as the laptop from hell. They hid it. They hid the information. Now, is there any reason that you should ever trust an investigative agency that has in its hands evidence of crimes? Evidence of Hunter Biden acting as a foreign agent without registering as one, Hunter Biden selling influence in the Biden vice presidency, Hunter Biden making millions of dollars from Ukraine and Moscow and Beijing. They hid the laptop. And then when the story was published, Congress said, we'd like to see what's on the laptop. And they said, I'm sorry, we've lost it. Now, this is an investigative agency that takes one of the biggest and most important pieces of evidence in a crime or suspected crime, and they lost it. Back in a moment. You're listening to The Lars Larson Show. Welcome back to The Lars Larson Show. It's a Wednesday. It's my pleasure to be with you and to deliver a little honestly provocative talk radio. And the world keeps serving up subjects that are so crazy, I couldn't make them up. If I smoked medical marijuana, I don't, and drank whiskey while I was doing the show, I couldn't make up stuff half as crazy as what's happening in the real world. Case in point, Assembly Bill 852, and this is from the great state of California. The bill would actually require judges to take into consideration a convict's race when determining how long to send them to prison. Now, I can't imagine that thing's going to survive constitutional testing in the courts, but I thought we'd test that idea with Zach Smith, who's a legal fellow with the Heritage Foundation, co-author with the great Cully Stimson of the new book called Rogue Prosecutors, How Radical Soros Lawyers Are Destroying America's Communities. Zach, welcome back.
Thanks for having me on, Lars.
Are they serious? Or I guess I should say, is he serious? Reggie Jones Sawyer, the Democrat chair of California's Assembly Public Safety Committee, who's saying that when somebody convicted of a crime stands in front of a judge, the judge should look at them and determine based on their race how long to send them to prison. Is there any way that can be constitutional or legal?
No, of course not. So it's not really a serious proposal in the sense that it won't survive constitutional scrutiny, but it is a serious proposal, unfortunately, in the sense that many on the left are advocating for this and apparently are pushing it through the California Assembly right now. But look, Lars, I thought we decided long ago that all of us as Americans should be treated equally, regardless of our race or ethnicity, in any walk of life, but especially in the criminal justice system. And so the idea that race can now be a factor in determining how long someone serves in prison for their crime, that potentially someone of one race could serve less time simply because of that person's race, not only is that unconstitutional, it's morally repugnant, too.
And you have to imagine that some of the fellow Assembly members, Reggie Jones Sawyer's fellow lawmakers, would raise that objection, maybe even have it, for a change, a Democrat raise the objection and say, we can't have judges look at somebody and say, well, I'd give you 10 years in prison, but you're white, so I'm going to give you 15 or 20 because white people have an advantage. Or I would give you 10 years in prison, but you're black, and we know that blacks are up against systemic racism, blah, and all that, so I'm going to give you probation. Go and sin no more. Is that really the way they envision this working?
Apparently so. But again, it's an absurd principle. It's one that clearly violates the Constitution as well as other laws that we have on the books. But look, this ties into a larger problem, Lars. Unfortunately, many on the left have bought into this myth that our criminal justice system is systemically racist. Now, Cully and I, we talk about it in our book, Rogue Prosecutors, that you just mentioned. We talk about this myth, how it came about, and how it's harmed the communities where elected officials, particularly elected district attorneys, have bought into this idea. Our criminal justice system is not systemically racist. We don't have a mass incarceration problem in our country, and yet many on the left keep pushing bills and proposals that are designed to solve this problem that doesn't exist. And it just creates problems from top to bottom wherever these policies have been implemented.
I'm talking to Zach Smith. He and Cully wrote the book Rogue Prosecutors. Just to illustrate this for people, because I know some of this involves things that people aren't even comfortable saying out loud. But let's put it this way. When it comes to murder, the worst crime you can commit in America, I guess short of treason, murder would be the worst crime you could commit. Black Americans commit murder disproportionately, far more often by proportion than white Americans do. That's factually accurate, correct?
It is, Lars. And the flip side of that is young black men are disproportionately victimized by violent crimes, particularly shootings and murders. And so the sad irony of many of these policies, and especially of the rogue prosecutor movement, is that these policies are designed supposedly to help minority members of the community, particularly young black men who many on the left claim are disproportionately impacted by these policies, who many on the left claim are targeted by police officers. But the fact is, where these policies have been implemented, violent crimes increase. And where violent crimes increase, that necessarily means, unfortunately, that more young black men are going to be victimized by those crimes.
Well, and Zach, the reason I bring up murder is that you could take almost any other category of crime and say, well, there may be underreporting or there may be prosecutorial discretion, because if you have somebody who commits, they steal something and the prosecutor looks at it, there are a lot of woke prosecutors now who say, well, those thefts were committed by a black suspect, so I'm going to decline to prosecute. But if it was a white suspect from a nice neighborhood, then I'm going to prosecute to the nth degree of the law. But when it comes to murder, virtually every single murder that occurs in America is reported, is investigated, and if they find a suspect, is charged. If they have a suspect and they got probable cause and they got enough to take it to a grand jury, they're going to get a charge out of it. So it's not one where you hear of a city where there are 10 murders and they had evidence on all 10, but they only charged 3 people and that all of them were black. And then there were 7 other people who could have had a murder case proved against them, but because of their skin color, they had that white supremacy thing going on, so therefore they didn't get charged. Murder gets charged almost every single time if there's anybody they can pin it, if there is a person they can pin it on based on the facts and the evidence, right?
Well, it should get charged, and you're right. It's hard to hide the bodies. That's why murder, it tends to be a reliable statistic showing what the crime rate in a locality actually is. But even for murder laws, many on the left are saying that, well, life in prison, certainly the death penalty, many on the left think is not an appropriate punishment for someone who commits murder, even someone who intentionally commits heinous acts of murder. I'll give you an example. In the D.C. City Council, they were proposing revising their criminal code. They proposed eliminating all mandatory minimums, even for violent crimes, and they proposed lowering the maximum sentence and the mandatory minimum for first-degree murder. And they only kept the mandatory minimum for first-degree murder because the blowback from across the community was so great. But unfortunately, again, many on the left have bought into this idea that we can not lock up violent criminals, that we can not prosecute violent criminals, that we can make race the predominant factor in considering what punishments to mete out to whom. And again, that just wreaks havoc. And more importantly, Lars, it violates our Constitution and the fundamental tenets of our society that everyone should be treated equally in the eyes of the law, regardless of their race.
It's funny, Zach. I'm talking to Zach Smith. He and Cully Stimson wrote Rogue Prosecutors. D.C. until recently had a great police chief, happened to be black, but he would come out and say, you want to get less violence, lock up the people with guns. And this guy is great. And within a few months, it's like, no, he's been hired away to the FBI. I think he was fleeing because he knew he was working for a city council and a mayor who probably were not going to back him up. Even though he had exactly the right attitude. You want to get less violent crime? Take the violent people, convict them, and lock them up in prison. And that's coming from a black police chief. And I wouldn't say he was shown the door, but I think there's a reason he went from being a police chief of a major American city to working somewhere in the FBI and has effectively disappeared from the public sphere because chances are he got some attention and it wasn't always positive. The book is called Rogue Prosecutors, How Radical Soros Lawyers Are Destroying America's Communities. Its authors are Zach Smith and Cully Stimson. Zach, thanks very much. What if you could help turn back the clock and help your dog play like a puppy again, no matter their age? It's Lars, and it sure works for Sir Winston Churchill, my Bernese Mountain Dog. That's why Dr. Marty developed Nature's Blend, because your dog needs a diet full of real cuts of meat, similar to what they'd eat in the wild. Dogs go bonkers for Nature's Blend. When given the choice between Nature's Blend Blend, and the giant online retailer's #1 bestseller in dry dog food, a study shows 29 out of 30 dogs choose Nature's Blend first. Tori from Tulsa says, my fur baby is so eager to eat it. Other dog foods I've tried gave my sweet boy issues with allergies. They all went away with Dr. Marty's and Nature's Blend. Give your dog a food they'll love and help support their youthful energy, healthy skin, easy digestion, and a happy full life. For a limited time, claim 54% off Nature's Blend and get a free pack of premium dog treats from Dr. Marty Pets. Go to drmartypets.com/pets or text PETS to 511-511. That's text PETS to 511-511. Study available on request, message, and data rates apply. Back in a moment. You're listening to The Lars Larson Show. Welcome back to The Lars Larson Show. It's a pleasure to be with you, and I'm always glad to get to your phone calls and emails. You know, I get probably hundreds. I don't think that I get thousands of emails every day that come from politicians and other interest groups that are pushing one cause or another. And I'm signed up to get an awful lot of emails that come from members of Congress, both Democrats and Republicans, because I want to know what the D Party is up to. So I got one the other day, and it was signed by Jeff Merkley, who is a U.S. Senator, also a member of the Democrat Party, and he was bemoaning the fact that there are still a stunning number of stillbirths in the United States of America, babies that don't make it out of the womb and do not survive, about 21,000 every year. And he was saying we have to find a way to reduce the number of stillborn babies. And I thought it was a bit ironic because this is coming from a guy who's very much a tried and true Democrat who advocates for abortion all the time and is now concerned about children who die as a result of a stillbirth. Wesley Smith joins us now, who's an author and senior fellow at the Discovery Institute Center on Human Exceptionalism. We talk to Wesley all the time about issues of life. Wesley, welcome back.
Hi, Lars. Thanks for having me.
I sent this one on to you, this press release from Senator Merkley, in which he was bemoaning the number of stillbirths. And I would join him in saying it's horrible that we have so many children who are conceived and come to some point in that pregnancy and then do not survive. And that a disproportionate number of those stillbirths are experienced by black mothers as well. But I found it kind of ironic, and I wanted to get your take on it as well, and perhaps talk about something the senator didn't talk about, which is I think there are some very real ways and ways that are available to just about everybody in this country to be able to avoid having a stillborn child.
Yeah, I read the press release too, and I had a reaction about a kind of a bitter irony. Certainly, we want Democrats and Republicans to come together to support actions that might reduce the number of stillbirths. But I looked up Senator Merkley. I'm not anywhere near Oregon where I live, so I wasn't sure of his record. And he's actually a co-sponsor of the Women's Health Protection Act, which basically would validate abortion through the 9th month. And since many stillbirths, or most stillbirths, the fetus dies later in the pregnancy, I just, the paradox there got to me. I thought, well, wait a second. Are some dead babies late in term bad and others good? Because that would seem to be what Senator Merkley would be thinking. And I also just looked up how many late-term abortions there are, and there are at least 12,000 a year in this country.
You could eliminate 12,000 deaths right there just by saying don't do any late-term abortions, which seems to be what a lot of states are choosing in their legislature right now.
Yeah, and you've got blue states, Vermont, Colorado, I assume Oregon, that basically have said there will be no limits on the right to abortion. It's an absolute abortion absolutism. Vermont even went so far as to say that embryos and fetuses have no independent rights, meaning something separate and apart from whether they're being gestated in a woman's body. But that would open the door to live fetal experimentation and so forth. So you have one part of this country, dead set on expanding access to abortion whenever or whatever or for whatever, and saying that unborn life has no value whatsoever. And then you have, well, if the baby's wanted, well, then we want to stop the stillbirth. I think the baby is the baby, regardless of the feelings of the mother at the time of the baby's death.
Is there any way that you can characterize why most of those stillbirths happen? Because Merkley, the senator, and his co-sponsor, who actually happens to be a Republican, but
Right.
they're saying they are
pro-life
proposing,
Republican, by the way.
pro-life. Bill Cassidy from Louisiana, Maternal and Child Health Stillbirth Prevention Act, as though by an act of Congress you can keep the babies alive. But aren't there fairly known causes as to what you could do? If you have good prenatal care all the way through a pregnancy, you're much less likely to have a stillborn child. Is that not true?
Yeah, and also the way that the mother takes care of her body. For example, if a mother becomes a massive substance abuser, that's going to affect the birth in many cases as well. I think the research they're talking about doing is good. I think the more we learn about it, that's fine. I just wish that we would have some consistency as to whether or not the death of late-term gestating babies is good or bad.
Because really what it comes down to then, if you say, well, some dead babies is not only okay, but it's something they want to pursue, that's the point of view of liberals in America. They say anytime a woman wants to get rid of a baby, she should be able to get rid of it right up to the moment of birth, but not after, not yet, unless we go the Peter Singer route. But if she doesn't want to get rid of the baby and the baby dies, we should try as hard as we can to prevent that. That's also their position, and they're going to try to prevent all that. They're not consistent positions at all, are they?
No, and it kind of highlights something that I've been concerned about lately. It's that good or bad is not so much based on principle as how we feel about something. And how we feel about something isn't the same as how we think about something. So if a woman feels she doesn't want to be pregnant, this is bothering. In fact, there was a interview with a late-term abortionist in the Atlantic, and he said that half of the late-term abortions he performs, we will often hear, well, the babies they're only late-term abortions if the baby's going to die or is severely disabled, and I'm not justifying that, but he said that half of the late-term abortions he does, there's absolutely nothing wrong with the baby at all. So there are healthy, that's what he said, and it's an interview in the Atlantic. People can look it up. There are at least some babies, late term, who are being induced into having a death because of abortion, either torn apart in the womb or induced. After the amniotic fluid has been drained. What strikes me that if a woman is 8 months pregnant and there's a reason for an abortion, you don't abort the child, you deliver the child.
Yeah. And by the way, there's another issue this ties into, I think, Wesley, because if it comes down to feelings, you say, why is the CDC, introducing these new guidances on chest feeding by men who are given hormones to cause them to lactate? Yeah. Well, it's all about the man. In other words, it's about the adult live human being who says, I want this experience. It's not about the baby. I mean, when a mother feeds a baby, it's about the baby. It's providing for the baby. But when it comes to, we're going to make you capable of lactating so you can have this experience, it's all about the adult, right?
Yeah, the whole transgender controversy, which of course has many permeations, but it is all about elevating the subjective, the feelings, intense feelings of people over the objective, that is, that which can be observed, that which can be measured. And with regard to children and transgender, what they call gender-affirming care, you're seeing other countries saying, we've got to hit the brakes on this. There is not the data to support that this is good for children, and it can cause sterility, it could cause other problems. Yet in the United States, we are probably the most radical country in that regard, and I suggest that it may be because we've decided to elevate the subjective over everything else, feelings over thinking, feelings over objective truth, and I think that's worrisome.
And a tragic story the other day out of Australia, where a child who'd gone trans and at 14 wanted to go back and found out, well, it's not really possible. That child took his own life. And because he was so frustrated by not being able to return to what he was before, and he never should have been changed to begin with. Back in a moment, Wesley, thank you very much. You're listening to The Lars Larson Show.
It's been 1 whole year since Roe v. Wade was overturned.
Which means they've been making abortion illegal.
all over the place.
So these are dark times.
These are dark times.
Dark times. Dark times.
Un tiempo muy oscuro. Because now that Roe v. Wade is overturned, a woman can get pregnant just from having sex.
Welcome back to the Lars Larson Show. That is from a parody that has been done by conservatives, and I think it's absolutely delicious. I mean, I love the fact that the U.S. Supreme Court, more than a year ago, June of last year, decided, hey, we've looked at the Constitution. We can't find anything in there that says that abortion is a constitutional right. In other words, precisely the opposite decision that was made back in 1973. And between 73 and last year, we lost 70 to 80 million Americans who would have been born except for Roe v. Wade. And now we've actually seen a net drop in the number of babies that are killed. We've seen a net increase in the number of babies put up for adoption. So conservatives have decided to celebrate. And they put together this little video. And I said, this is fantastic. It's the right to have fun by making fun of the liberals who've just lost their minds in the years since the Supreme Court correctly threw out so-called abortion rights, which nobody could ever actually find in the U.S. Constitution. Welcome to the Lars Larson Show. It's a pleasure to be with you, and I'm always glad to get your calls at 866-HEY-LARS. That's 866-439-5277. Send your emails to talk@larslarson.com, and if you happen to be a naysayer, somebody who disagrees with my point of view, I'd be glad to put you right to the head of the line. We've been doing that for more than 26 years. And welcome to the Radio Northwest Network, which has served the Pacific Northwest states, Oregon, Washington, and Idaho through 24 great radio affiliate stations spread out all over the region. We've done that for the last 23 and a half years. Now, about that video, I think this video actually made some fantastic points, and I even tried to imagine how the left might try to make fun of the same situation, because right after that decision was leaked out months before the U.S. Supreme Court actually announced it officially in June, the left absolutely lost their mind. They said this is going to be the end of civilization, because without abortion, we'll have more babies born. But this little video I thought was just absolutely great. One part of it talked about marriage. Listen to that.
Okay, so new idea here. I think that a man and a woman, before they have sex, need to draw up some sort of contract that says, I promise to take care of you and you promise to take care of me, and we both promise to take care of any kids that we produce together. I mean, like, I know it's new, I know it's shocking, I know it's out there, but that kind of contract is the only way that I see us moving forward.
That's marriage.
No, it's not.
You see why it's so easy to make fun of liberals? It is marriage. You know, we got to have some kind of agreement. And of course, you've also got the question of values and the trustworthiness of the other person that now actually seems to matter to young women. Listen to that.
I find myself in this really bizarre state where I'm asking guys about things like their values and trustworthiness before sleeping with them.
Yeah, imagine that kind of concept. And for guys, well, there are questions for guys that they have to answer as well. Listen to that part of it.
Before a girl will have sex with me now, she's asking me all these dumb questions like, do you love me? And what happens if I get pregnant? And do you have a job? Like, I don't know. And of course, it talks about the issue of responsibility. Listen to that.
It's like the government is making me responsible for a bunch of stuff I shouldn't be responsible for, like my sex life and my children.
You know, that's why it is so easy. And I think this is one of the places where conservatives and Republicans fall flat on their face most of the time. Not in the case of this video. In this video, and we'll be glad to, we'll put the link up on my website at larslarson.com. But this is where we fall flat on our face. We have to understand that sometimes the best way to convince somebody that an idea is completely stupid is not to do what I probably do most of the time, which is give you an avalanche of facts and figures and logic and the law and all that. You got to be able to take the other idea and say, oh, so now you've actually got to think about whether or not you sleep with somebody. You got to think about the implications of having children. You might even want to have an agreement with the other person. I'll take care of you for the rest of your life, and you'll take care of me for the rest of the life, or your life, our life, my life, and we'll take care of any children we produce. What a crazy new idea. That's what we're talking about here. And it's why I think this is something new for conservatives, and thank goodness it's coming from younger people. To your calls now. If you want to join the best conversation in talk journalism, it's 866-HEY-LARS. That's 866-439-5277. Send your emails to talk@larslarson.com. And if you want to answer our Twitter poll, you'll find it a couple of places. Number one, on Twitter, @Lars Larson Show, and at larslarson.com. Just answer the question. Doesn't cost any money. Might be habit forming, that kind of thing. But I think that's perfectly okay. I'll tell you what. But I would ask you this question. Have you talked to some of your friends who are very, very upset about the fact that Roe v. Wade was thrown out a year ago? And if you're a conservative, even if you're just a little bit conservative, have you thought about asking them, is it really a bad thing that there are now an estimated another 10 or 20,000 babies who've been born this year in the last 12 months who would not have been born had Roe v. Wade been kept in place by the current Supreme Court? And is that a bad thing? And I've heard so many callers will tell me, well, Lars, if you had those kids up for adoption, well, are there enough adoptive families to take care of them? And the answer to that one is easy, because of course there are. There are Americans who are just praying that they ever get the opportunity to raise an adopted child as their own. And you say, hold on, there can't be that many. Let me suggest something to you. I can remember 25 years ago, there was a young lady who worked at the TV station where I worked, and she said, I'm going to China. I said, why are you going to China? She said, because I've always wanted a child. My husband and I have always wanted a child. And I said, well, why don't you adopt one? And she said, you go to the adoption agencies and they'll tell you that you have almost no chance of getting an adopted child here. You'll have to go somewhere else, go to Romania, go to China, go to other places on planet Earth. The need for children is so great, and the left doesn't seem to understand it. And when you say, well, America's population is rapidly aging, think about how much less our average aging would be if we hadn't killed 70 million kids over the last 50 years or so. Let's go to Linda. Hey, Linda, welcome to the Lars Larson Show. What's on your mind?
Hi, Lars. What's on my mind is me as a 17-year-old having a first sexual experience and getting pregnant and going to a Catholic girls' school and not knowing what to do, not knowing how to tell anybody, and trying to commit suicide, and the resultant. Anyway, what the heck is happening about birth control? Why isn't birth control being promoted?
It's available. Linda, it's more available today than it's ever been. Thank you for the call. You got the Lars Larson Show.